Hello, welcome to this meeting of the Barbados Genealogy Group for March 2023. I greet all of those joining us on Zoom as well as those on Facebook Live. My name is Harriet Pierce, the facilitator for the group. I hope that you're all doing well. Today we welcome Professor Pedro Welch, who will speak on the topic Tracking Post-Emancipation Barbadian Migration to Trinidad. In this presentation, Professor Welch will examine factors underlying migration to Trinidad and Tobago in the post-emancipation period up to the 1940s. He will also attempt to place the Barbadian migrants into their Trinidadian localities and thus provide some clues that might assist those seeking to research their genealogical linkages to this group. Professor Welch, who is again no stranger to this group, actually he was our first speaker back in March of 2014. He is a retired deputy principal of the University of the West Indies, Cape Hill. He also served as Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education and Professor of Social and Medical History in the Department of History and Philosophy at UWI. He is the recipient of a number of awards. These include a Commonwealth Scholarship in 1984, a 1992 Johns Hopkins Fellowship, and in December 2009, the Principal's Award of Excellence at UWI. In November of 2010, he was given a special award as Alumnus of the Month in recognition of his appointment to a professorship. Professor Welch has written and co-authored several books and articles and has delivered public addresses at home in Barbados, in several Caribbean countries, and internationally in the USA, the UK, France, and Canada. He has appeared in television productions of the BBC and the NBC as a consultant in Caribbean history. This includes the film, Who Do You Think You Are?, which featured the film star Gwyneth Paltrow and was aired on NBC in April of 2011. He has served on several boards and committees, including chair of the Task Force on Reparations in Barbados. So I think we have a lot to look forward to this evening. But just before Professor Welch takes the microphone, just want to remind you to hold your questions until the end of the presentation. You can either type your questions in the Q&A or use the raise hand feature, and we will allow you to ask your question on the mic. If you're entering any comments or greetings, we'll want you to do that in the chat at the bottom of the screen. So now we will hear from Professor Welch.
Yes, thank you very much, Harriet. It's really a pleasure to be here again. I hadn't realized that it was that long since I had spoken to the group in that very first session. And now it is my pleasure to be here again and to share some of the ideas that I've looked at, some of the issues I've looked at when it comes to the question of Barbadian migration to Trinidad and Tobago. I also wish to offer my greetings to those who are here as part of the group, and maybe to anyone who may be also connected with us from overseas, any special friends that we may have. The question of migration to Trinidad has not really received a lot of attention in the scholarly literature, but certainly many Barbadians can speak of the fact that they have relatives who migrated to Trinidad a long time ago, some who never returned. In my own marital situation, my wife's family can speak of a relative who left Barbados and migrated to Trinidad and who never returned, although a daughter from that family returned at some point, long after that early migration. So here we are trying to see if we can find some of the elements that go into making for strong migration, strong migratory movement from Barbados and Trinidad. Today, I want to first deal with, however, even though our look is at the post-emancipation period, I also want to step back into the pre-emancipation period because some of the antecedents of Barbadian migration to Trinidad and Tobago begin in that early period from 1764 or even before. So here we are, again, looking at Barbadian migration to Trinidad and Tobago, but with a look also at the question of the pre-emancipation movement or some attempts to move. In considering the emigration of Barbadians to Trinidad and Tobago or Trinidad in the post-emancipation period and in fact in the pre-emancipation period, it is useful for us to note some important historical developments that characterize the economic and social profile of the host country, that is Trinidad and Tobago. For much of its colonial life, Trinidad was under Spanish colonial administration. And by the time that the island was ceded to the British in 1802, the sugar industry was in its nascent stage of development. Under British colonial administration, the sugar industry began to expand, but one major drawback on its development was a severe labor shortage. So we are already in the very early stage of British occupation, British settlement of Trinidad and Tobago. We are already looking at some of the issues that lead to migration. While the rest of the British colonial empire in the Caribbean met the labor needs of the sugar industry through the labor of enslaved workers in the pre-emancipation period, and later, of course, of migrants, indentured labor from India, China, and other places. Later, the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807 meant that sugar planters in Trinidad faced some difficulties in getting the cheap, steady, and tractable labor force that they desired. Thus, long before the migration to Trinidad of the post-emancipation period, we can trace the beginnings of an intra-regional migration to the pre-emancipation period as Trinidadian planters sought to get the necessary labor resources. Not only Trinidadian planters, however, we must also know that Barbadian sugar planters also had an interest, and that is something we'll pick up very, very shortly as we begin to trace the issues that took place in the pre-emancipation period. In this introductory context, we may note or consider two documentary extracts from the pre-emancipation period as providing some insights into the perceptions of people in Barbados concerning the need of laborers in the Trinidadian colony, in Trinidad and Tobago. We are referring here, of course, to two petitions submitted by planters requesting permission to export enslaved workers to Trinidad and other Caribbean destinations. As I point out, the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807 represented the first tranche in a process that was designed to effect the gradual abolition of enslavement. At least that had been the expectation of British abolitionists. However, the abolition of the slave trade coincided with the increased demand for labor occasioned by the acquisition of Trinidad and British Guyana, among other crown colonies. Planters in Barbados and other older sugar colonies, therefore, viewed access to the fertile soils in the newly acquired territories as an opportunity to circumvent the restrictions in the movement of enslaved labor across the region that was imposed under the 1807 Act to abolish the slave trade and under later legislation. Philip Curtin, the celebrated historian of the slave trade, refers to this issue when he observes, in the early 19th century, after the British slave trade had legally ended, British planters moved slaves to the new planting frontiers of Trinidad and British Guyana, end of quote. So even though I said on bulk of our examination will look at the post-emancipation period. Long before we get to that post-emancipation period, planters are moving enslaved workers to Trinidad and British Guyana. Now, that will say something to us because this is not the only occasion when planters move laborers out of Barbados and send them elsewhere. When the Carolinas were settled, Barbadian planters also moved enslaved workers. And so therefore, it is not going to be surprising if we visit Trinidad or Tobago, or for that matter, the Carolinas and elsewhere, that you walk on the street somewhere and you see somebody that looks like you. There's a kinship relationship that may exist between many of those who we will meet on the street. And it is not necessarily a recent kinship relationship. It is an older one. The export of enslaved workers in this intra-Caribbean slave trade caught the attention of abolitionists in Britain, and it's not long before the imperial naval authorities were combing the Caribbean seas in search of contraband slave labor. Indeed, as Hugh Thomas notes, early in the 19th century, the issue of stocking Trinidad with enslaved workers became a talking point in parliamentary debates. The matter reached a head in 1824 when an act was passed in the British Parliament outlawing the intercolonial trade in slaves. Given the tone and intent of the 1824 legislation, it is somewhat surprising that in the post-1824 period, Barbadian planters were pressing the local and metropolitan leadership to permit the exportation of slave labor to Trinidad. Perhaps it has seen a glimmer of hope in the realization that some limited export of slaves was still possible by way of petition to the king and council. That is, the legislation permitted some movement of enslaved laborers in an intercolonial trade, provided that can be shown that this was not to the disadvantage of the laborers. Thus it was on August 29th, 1828, that Howard Bovell, that's a good major name, could petition the colonial secretary as follows: Sir, under the Act of Parliament, which authorizes His Majesty to permit the emigration of slaves from one island in the West Indies to another, I solicit an order in council to allow the transfer of a number of quote unquote Negro families to Trinidad. Yes, yes. So there you have it. So long before the post-emancipation period, here's a Barbadian planter who is seeking to get the permission to transship, to migrate slave workers from Barbados to Trinidad, and obviously from Trinidad to Trinidad later when Tobago becomes aligned politically and otherwise Trinidad to Tobago as well. Notice that in his petition, he talks about the transfer of a number of Negro families, and I thought that was particularly important. Bovell's petition was filled with a language of deception, if not with conciliation. More than likely, the use of the term transfer rather than the term export or even migration might have been designed to buttress his requests on the basis of his rights in property. Additionally, his reference to Negro families might have been a clever ploy intended to suggest adherence to the amelioration proposals, which mandated that families should not be separated. That's slave families. Moreover, Bovell went a step further in his appeal. He declared that he was fully aware that the removal of the slave must be for the benefit of the slave himself or herself, as may be, and proceeded thereafter to state that his proposal was based on just that principle, the question of the benefit of the enslaved. Thus, we find he asserts, and in a few minutes we'll see a little extract from what he asserts, that the landed property in which I have an interest in Barbados, like most plantations in the island, is so completely occupied that no portion of it is left in the relative possession of the slave. In the sake of the economy, the land is retained in the hands of the owner. Now listen to this carefully. It is cultivated by the joint operation of the slaves, and the food is collected and stored in a common granary and disposed periodically. But if the families be removed to Trinidad, I want you to see the duplicity that he is offering to us in his request to ship Barbadian families to Trinidad. He said, but if the families, that means slave families, we remove to Trinidad, which does not suffer like Barbados, under an excessive population, as Trinidad, I shall be enabled to assign to them an adequate quantity of fertile land. You're talking about enslavement. And you're talking migration of these enslaved workers. And here, the trickery of Bovell is revealed. There are several falsehoods in Bovell's missive. The statement that the food produced on cultivable lands in Barbados was collected following a collaborative cultivation by enslaver and enslaved. There's a produce stored in a common granary, represents a gross understatement of the exploitative labor relations that existed in the Barbadian slave society. Having broached the subject of advantage to the enslaved worker, Bovell went on to near the point home by asserting that the situation in Trinidad will lend itself to the broader objectives of amelioration. Thus he gushes. He goes on to say, there, sir, feelings which are generated by the possession of a species of property are allowed full play. New enjoyments and desires stir the faculties of the mind and develop them in the effort to supply the means of gratification, and the improvement, moral and intellectual, of the Negro will be grafted in self-interest. I mean, he must think that the readers, Augusta, they are stupid. I mean, you can see what he's trying to do. I mean, he's trying to get the British authorities to step on his side. Well, the fact remains that whatever the selling points of Bovell's argument, he was the one underlying motivation of his effort to obtain enslaved labor for the two plantations, Union and Trafalgar, that had been acquired by himself and a brother, William Bovell. That this effort, that's an effort to obtain that labor. That's really the motivation. Unfortunately for the Bovells, in a note appended to the petition, the colonial secretary, while recommending that the proposal should be forwarded to the King and Council, noted that it had negative implications for the prohibitions levied under the 1824 Act. If Bovell's petition represented a last gap effort to use the principles of amelioration to squeeze the last juices out of a contracted slave system, his contemporary, Robert Elias Fitz, and I'm not sure if he's the one whose name is applied to Fitz Village, in St. James, was perhaps even more direct, this petition by Robert Fitz. Fitz seems clear in his mind that amelioration was but an advanced phase in the eventual abolition of slavery. Indeed, in his letter to George Murray, he claims to be actuated by a general principle of philanthropy, which had led him to submit to his Majesty's government a proposal, sanctioning which would conduce to the great object held in view by the British public, the amelioration and more speedy termination of slavery. Having thus delivered the desired protocol, Fitz then proceeds to lay the foundation of his petition for the export of slave labor from Trinidad, from Barbados to Trinidad, he proposed to limit the exportation of enslaved workers from Barbados or any other overstock place to a period of 20 years or any other period. Moreover, he comes up with what can be possibly be viewed as one of the most ingenious proposals to come from the planter class in the British West Indies at the time of the discussion about abolition and immigration. In that context, the first clause of his proposal stated, and we have it available to you here, that slaves removed from Barbados or any other place to Trinidad be employed as agricultural or plantation labor to serve 14 years only as slaves. And at the expiration of that time to be deemed and taken ipso facto as free persons, and from thenceforth to be entitled to all the rights and privileges of free persons. I mean, again, you must think that the colonial office were filled with idiotic imbeciles who had no common sense. The second stage of his, that is Fitz's proposal, specified that if any female enslaved worker gave birth to a child during the 40-year period that he was proposing in Trinidad, then such child or children would attain their freedom at the age of 21 years. And this is, remember, this is before emancipation, but the plans are sure that emancipation is coming, and the attempt to begin to ship enslaved workers to Trinidad and Tobago, in fact, is an attempt to, as it were, to get the last juices that they could get out of the slave system. In the third and fourth clauses of the proposals suggested that the protector of slaves, both in Barbados and Trinidad, would be asked to oversee the system and to evaluate it. It appears that Fitz's proposals caught the attention of the British authorities, and some of what he was proposing might well be seen in the apprenticeship period that became a part of the general abolition. The point, however, that we wish to make here is that the abolition, the abolition of enslavement in 1838 really exacerbated the labor situation. And it was then in 1838 that the planters turned to, in Trinidad, having been thwarted in their desire to get slaves from Barbados, that they turned to indentured East Indian and Chinese labor. However, they also turned their attention after emancipation to other British West Indian sources, and that is where Barbados is identified as a possible supplier. Further consideration of the situation in Trinidad reveals that just 6 years after emancipation, most of Trinidad was largely undeveloped. Of the estimated 1.5 million acres, most of this was uncultivated and large tracts were owned by the Crown. Of the 200,000 acres owned by private landowners, it appears that less than half were cultivated. There were some 32,000 acres under cane, another 25,000 were dedicated to cocoa cultivation. Just 3 years after emancipation, it is estimated that the labor force consisted of some 10,000 persons. However, by 1859, this had grown to 19,000, including about 4,000 who had migrated from other Caribbean territories, most apparently from Barbados. And the following table that we're going to see in a moment illustrates both the numbers and the geographical spread of West Indian migrants in Trinidad over the period between 1851 and 1891. Before I go any further, let me step back a bit in our discussion just to point out that my discussion about Robert Fitz and Bovell is really designed to indicate that there's something happening in the Caribbean in the pre-emancipation period where planters are attempting to shift labor across the Trinidad and British Guyana. So, and some labor was taken over. Some labor was moved before the amelioration proposals were put in place by the British government. So that if we were to examine the Trinidadian and the Tobagonian Afro population and to do genetic analysis and to compare that genetic analysis to our Barbadian the Afro population, we will probably find that there are some connections that date back to that pre-emancipation period and not just the post-emancipation period. But we move past that initial discussion, what was happening in the pre-emancipation period. And here we are now looking at the whole question of Trinidadian West Indian migration to Trinidad in the period now after emancipation had come. And this table that we're seeing here, that we're looking at now, gives us some ideas as to where people are going and where they're coming from. Now, it doesn't say Barbados, but I need to make it abundantly clear that Barbados provides the vast majority of the migrants to Trinidad and Tobago from the other Caribbean territories in this period that we're looking at. So in 1851, which is the first thing that we see on the screen, there's some 10,800 migrants who go into Trinidad. And you see where they're going. A lot of them are going to Port of Spain. Some, of course, going to places St. Anne's, Diego Martin, Tacarica, Hoover, and those who know us who know a little bit of Trinidad, these locations. We'll probably begin to see a pattern of settlement that will alert us as to where our ancestors or relatives had gone. San Fernando is another place that we find a lot of the migrants going. And places like Naparima. These are names that are probably alien to most Barbadians. These are names, some of these names are, of course, names that come from the Amerindian presence in Trinidad, places like Arima, and those other places like that are names that come from the Amerindians. But you also have other names which speak of other influences in Trinidad. You have Blanchisseuse. I think that's the pronunciation a little further up. Not many go there, but that's a French area because the French were heavily involved in Trinidad as well. In 1861, as you can see, the numbers are fairly consistent. They're not all that removed, but you have another few thousand, another 1,000 or so who migrate. But again, they're going to pretty much the same places. And part of the reason why we put this particular table here for your viewing is because it gives a sense to us of where people are distributed and why in fact, they're going to certain locations. And these locations, again, represent what we call the residential centers where the migrants could be found. But not only that, it suggests to me that people are moving not ignorantly, but they're moving with knowledge. The people who are coming later know where the others have gone, and that is where they are likely to go as well. In 1861. Now, numbers have increased rapidly and exponentially by 1891, because by 1891, the numbers have more than just tripled. And when you look at 1891, now you get again Port of Spain gets the largest number of migrants, 10,565. And we don't understand why this is important, but for us, it also helps us again to identify where's the locus of the migrant residents in Trinidad, where they're going. St. Anne's, Diego Martin again, Tacarica, Arima, places like that, Chaguanas, Cuba, Savannah Grande, San Fernando. These are very important locations for the workers who are going to Trinidad. Now, I have something on the screen here, but we're not going to pay attention to it yet. But keep it there as I continue just a minute to say a few more things about the statistics that we looked at. While the total West Indian migrant immigrant population as presented in these statistics might be understated due to the fact that not all migrants follow the legal channels for immigration. The figures that we were looking at a few minutes ago are figures that speak to those people who are recorded. But one must remember that West Indians, Barbadians are very inventive people. And we know that the official shipping that is taking some Barbadian workers to these locations. But not all Barbadian workers go on the official channels. They go on schooners, they make their way and they stow away and they get into these locations. So that as Walton Lai observes in his book Indentured Labor, Caribbean Sugar, published by the Johns Hopkins University Press in 1993, there were almost 14,000 Barbadian migrants as captured by 1896 in the official statistics. 14,000, that's almost half of the migrants that we have looking at in the paper there seem to be coming from Barbados. About 44%, in fact, of the group. Luke Lai himself quotes a memorandum from Alfred Tracy, an expatriate cocoa planter who was not in favor of migration of East Indian laborers. Rather, he said, and it actually there, I thought I had that one here, that more stress should be placed on encouraging free immigrants from other islands, especially from Barbados. And he says a labor bureau should be established in the immigration department to furnish newcomers with information about employers' needs in Trinidad. Bridget Breton writing on the Trinidadian Barbadian migration tells us something, however, that Barbadian migrants in particular were disliked by the planters for being too independent and insular. Now, I wish to spend just a little moment on that because there's a prevailing view that Barbadians are docile. They behave themselves. She goes on to say, by 1840s, it was 1842, I think this, 1842, 1847, less than 3,000 of the West Indians were said to be still working for the sugar estate. So in the early period, West Indians had gone, Barbados had gone, but a lot of them were not working on the estates. They were not. The figures that we looked at as well show that Barbadian and other West Indian workers spread themselves across the island, with relatively large numbers settling in urban areas. Now, if the assumption was that they were going to become sugar workers in Trinidad, that did not seem to be always the case. They were going for other opportunities. In the case of the Tacarigua Ward, which is a place where there were options for small farming, there was a significant settlement of Barbadians in Tacarigua. And Ramesar, this is a researcher who's looking at this whole issue, says that Tacarigua Ward was the crossroads of population inflow. Long an area of British West Indian settlement, it included numerous Barbadian cane farmers, also Vincentians and Grenadians who worked on the cocoa estates in the valleys of a northern region. That is what I'm saying here. that when Barbadians left Barbados and went to Trinidad, many of them were recruited as laborers. But once they arrived in Trinidad, many of them found themselves becoming small proprietors. They're going to sugar small cane farming. There can be little doubt that some Barbadian migrants, as reported by Howard Johnson, were attracted to Trinidad by the availability of land for squatting. And note the difference between Barbados and Trinidad. Barbados consists of 106,000 acres, 107,000 or so, of which the plantations own about 90%. So there's no land in Barbados. So when Barbadians are migrating to Trinidad and to Tobago, these Barbadians are often in search of that opportunity which they could not access in their homeland. The average daily wage in Barbados for males over the period between 1870 and 1900 was 10 pennies. While in Trinidad, wages range between 1 shilling upwards and 2 shillings. In addition, we may note that besides the more permanent settlements of migrant laborers, there's a regular traffic of transients from Barbados, many who did no agricultural labor, but at times might seek temporary employment in the skills trades or in the urban spaces, porters, etc. This brings us to the question of the occupational profiles of migrants and also the expectations of labor relations. We're just trying to move on. We got another table here, so we can see something again. We can get another. Yes, yes, there it is. Yes, there you have it. Now, something slipped off in my transcription of the thing, but I'll tell you what it is. That first section, as I said, is the title there should be occupational profiles. Under that, you have officials, professionals, then domestics, then commercial work, agricultural labor, that's the next one. Then after that, you have industrial labor, and then unemployed, no definite occupation profile. And these are the comparative occupational profiles of Afro-Trinidadians, British West Indian and East Indian migrants. If we look here at the occupational profiles, and you look at some of the percentages, you see something here. If you go to the other BWI, that field, that's a reference there to, as I said, most of these are Barbadians. Don't miss the point. When we say other BWI, British West Indians, yes, you might include some Grenadians, some other people there, but the vast majority of the Afro-Trinidadian population, by the time you get into the 1890s, is in fact Barbadian. You also have other Afro-Trinidadians, but let's look at it, other BWI. If you look at them, about the largest proportion is made up of domestics. No, not the largest, sorry, my mistake here. The largest proportion, a little down, is in industrial labor, 38.65%. That compares with the Afro-Trinidadians. And then you have the agricultural laborers, 25.06%, and domestics, 24.52%. But again, this helps us to see where people are going, what kind of professions they're going into. And we'll see a bit more about that in a few minutes, because the point is that these Barbadian workers who are going to Trinidad are not trying to recreate the conditions that they had in Barbados. As I said, they're looking to be higher up and better off. That's what they're doing. So table 2, which we have there still on the screen, shows that the bulk of the migrants were working in industrial pursuits, which essentially meant that significant numbers found employment as masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, tailors, coopers, bakers, painters, and shoemakers. This sector accounted for almost 40% of the migrant West Indian population in the 1890s. Another 50% was distributed equally between agricultural and domestic occupations. Additionally, you may note that British West Indian migrants, of whom again the majority are Barbadians, but over 25% of public officers and clerks, about 60% of the postal and prison workers, and about 85% of the policemen. That's a particularly important statistic. Indeed, as Howard Johnson informs us, of roughly 600 policemen in Trinidad in 1897, 400 were Barbadians. 400 out of 600. And just 2 years earlier, that 1895, half of the domestic servants in Port of Spain were also from Barbados. We may also note that some 22% of the teachers in Trinidad by 1896 and 97 were British West Indian migrants. Again, the vast majority of whom were Barbadians. So we find them as policemen, we find them as teachers, and that has implications for the Trinidadian society. So we're going to see in a couple of minutes. We're going to see how this is working out in terms of this impact on the profile of the Afro population in Trinidad. Yes, that's all that for a minute with us. Howard Johnson's description that we just heard of the Trinidadian labor population mirror those of Bridget Brereton. And we note here Bridget Brereton's assessment of at least one aspect of Barbadian migration to Trinidad. She tells us with reference to the 1890s, there was a strong resentment against the police. One reason was that the ranks were predominantly Barbadian. We just heard that a few minutes ago. In 1892, out of 506 men, this is another statistic, and the one that we just got from Howard Johnson. 2 out of 506, 292 were Barbadian. 137 were from other islands, and only 47 were Trinidad Creoles. The government deliberately employed quote unquote small islanders. Now listen, don't let us run from this particular one. Barbadians were often fond of referring to people from islands bigger than Barbados as small islands, low islanders. But one has to understand this is a perception that is mirrored in how the various groups interacted. So the government employed quote unquote small islanders as part of the classic imperial policy of divide and rule. And the popular view was that Barbadians were also admitted to the force, the police force, even though they had a known criminal record. And they repaid the Creole population for their contemptuous attitude because the Creole don't like them at all, by systematic police brutality and persecution, the Barbadian policemen. Lower class Creoles, we are told by Bridget Brereton, used their knowledge of patois. We have to remember that Trinidad had a Spanish origin, had a large French population at one time, and had their own way of speaking. Incidentally, I met a Trinidadian several years ago, and he was talking about a fellow, and he said to me that he can understand why you've had to stop baboosieting. Now, most of you will have not a clue what he meant by that. But I speak Spanish, so I understand the Spanish word to stammer is babusear. And so here was this Trinidadian telling me that this fellow won't stop babuseting, so that means stammering. And it's part of what was happening. So what we are told is that the lower class Creoles use their knowledge of patois which most Barbadians did not understand, as a kind of weapon against the policemen. The deep resentment against the police force came to head in 1880 to 1884, when Captain Baker, the chief of police, broke up the police spare bands during Carnival and brought Carnival under tight control. It is not surprising that the official report on the Carnival riots of the 1880s mentioned a very strong prejudice against the police on the part of Trinidadians of all classes, but especially from the Black working class. They did not like the Barbadian policemen. And there's a reason why they didn't like them. And it has to do with some issues, including, for example, the Barbadian policemen tend to be better educated. And I've always often thought about that. Why it was that these Barbadian migrants, what is that? What advantage do they have in Barbados? Well, Barbados is much smaller than Trinidad. What advantage? Well, I'm guessing. Barbados is a small place, relatively flat. You can get from any part of Barbados to another part of Barbados without any difficulty. So if it comes to schooling, there's no difficulty in getting access to a place to go to school. In other islands of the Caribbean, including the more mountainous islands, and I include St. Vincent, Dominica, St. Lucia. In many of those countries, if you were living on the other one side of the mountain, to get access to a place, you might have to go wrong by sea. Otherwise, in Barbados, you don't have that problem. So once education began to spread in Barbados, everybody could get there. You could walk. I think in case of Jamaica, you go to Jamaica, and if you live in the Blue Mountain area, you might not have access. Barbadians had a jump start. And therefore, when you look at the migrants who could come from Barbados and they go through the entire Caribbean, you ask people from St. Croix, ask them from the Turks and Caicos, ask them anywhere in the Caribbean, who was all the people I'm talking about, who was your head teacher? Who was your teacher? And they'll tell you it was a Bayesian. And I said, that's one thing that happens. Barbadians get marked as being a bit aloof, being a little higher up and better off. That's a problem. Breton points out that in the case of the Barbadians in Trinidad were particularly active supporters of reform in the government service, particularly in the area of San Fernando. And she says, unlike the majority of Creoles, rural Creoles, the Barbadians spoke English well and were often literate. And this gave them entry to strategic jobs in teaching, the public service, and skilled crafts. They seem to have advanced faster within the system than the patois-speaking Creoles. It may have been that their command of English and their familiarity with electoral politics in Barbados equipped them better than working class Creoles to participate in the various political reform movements in Trinidad. For all the evidence suggests that most working class Creoles, that's the ordinary average Trinidadian, and the Indians were uninvolved in political reform, but the Barbadians were. One of the features of the Barbadian migrant community, especially as it relates to employment, should I say labor market, was the effort which migrants undertook to retain some personal independence in their labor relations practices. This is the majority of sources in our study inform us. There's a marked avoidance of labor contracts. Barbadians did not sign up for any labor contracts. They left, went to Trinidad, and they wanted an independent arrangement. In that context, we take note of Howard Johnson's observation based on his mining of contemporary forces that, quote, the Barbadians will work, but only as free laborers, not as coolie slaves. As evidence of this stance of the Barbadian migrants, You know that Barbados, who has signed contracts in Barbados at all, denied the same on arrival in Trinidad. In other words, I signed a contract in Barbados, but once I arrived in Trinidad, I may not sign a contract. I didn't sign a contract. This is a case of 100 Barbadians who, according to one immigration agent, had signed such a contract before the authorities in Barbados. But, quote, now, we predated them in Trinidad and even denied knowing the magistrate before whom they had signed the contract. That's our Barbadian forefathers who went. Such mass denial could hardly have occurred unless there had been a plan of these laborers to defraud the recruiters. In that case, some collaboration with the immigration agent might also be inferred. We also note that the employers in Trinidad frequently complained that Barbadian migrants were unwilling to take orders, or were often as rude in their verbal encounters with employers as if they were British, quote unquote, British workmen. We summarize this section of our presentation by singling out one individual of Barbadian migrant stock for special mention. I know we have something on the screen, but keep it there. That's related, and you'll see that in a minute what I will have to do with. This question of this Barbadian that we're going to look at for a moment relates to our general understanding that the varied occupational and skill sets represented in the Barbadian migrant population are part of a complex history that characterizes the struggle of Black West Indians against an all-white oligarchic colonial administration. Out of this group, in alliance with their Black Creole counterparts, several individuals arise who form part of the leadership of the Pan-Africanist movement that emerges in Trinidad and the wider Caribbean in the early 20th century. So within this migrant group, we have people who are engaged in the struggle with the white oligarchic structure. And one individual that we identify is a man known as George Padmore. Now, when you hear the name Padmore, immediately, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. The name Padmore is a quintessential Barbadian English name. Padmore was not born as Padmore, however. Padmore was born as Malcolm Nurse. That's another strong Barbadian named Nurse. So a descendant of Barbadian migrants. I refer to him as Barbadian because Padmore, because that's his origin. But he wasn't born in Barbados. His parents were born, grandparents were born in Barbados. His grandfather was one Hubert Alfonso Nurse, another smattering of good Barbadian names, who was apparently formerly enslaved on the Bell Plantation in Barbados. Hubert Nurse arrived in Trinidad in the 1870s. His grandson, George Padmore we're talking about, and the name Padmore apparently was later adopted for whatever reason we don't know, was born sometime between 1902 and 1904 in Trinidad. Between the 1920s and 30s, Padmore became the single most important representatives of the Communist International in the African and Afro-Caribbean world. In his life and contribution, we might see the very symbol of opportunity sought and won in the migration of thousands of Barbadian workmen and some women to Trinidad and other places. What I'm making here is that the profile we have of the Barbadian migrant is one that doesn't fit well with our presumption that again Barbadians are docile, quiet people. Many Barbadians who migrated became leaders in the struggle against the white oligarchic structure. Essentially, this doesn't happen only in Trinidad. Hubert Critchlow, the famous labor leader in then British Guyana, is again of Barbadian origin. And we find many of them. And again, we point back to the superior educational profile of Barbadians who travel through the Caribbean and elsewhere. So Padmore becomes one of the most important figures of the 20th century, early 20th century, really one of the outstanding activists in Trinidad and recognized across the world. I just noticed a note one of our watchers is born in Belmont, and he's thinking that with Port of Spain, where Padmore might well have settled. That's all right. That's quite possible. So in his life, because Padmore's life, we see again, I said, the opportunity that people are left Barbados for. Padmore becomes the spokesman for Russian communists, but eventually breaks with the Russian communism in favor of a Pan-Africanist approach. And at first, he was not so much in tune with Marcus Garvey and the Garveyite movement, but later became a strong supporter of that movement. So Padmore, one of the symbols of Barbadian independence. Another activist with Barbadian roots, of course, was Clement Payne, no listed as the national hero of Barbados. So Woodville Marshall is perhaps the most prominent historian to attempt to chronicle Clement Payne's political development, although other researchers have unearthed some aspects of Payne's political development as well. Payne was born in Trinidad in 1904 to Barbadian parents who moved back to Barbados when he was about 4 years old. Payne attended Bay Street Boys School and subsequently worked for some years as a junior clerk. In 1927, he returned to Trinidad, where as an advocate of social justice, he was involved in the growth of a militant trade unionist group and was a member of the group called the Negro Workers Cultural and Social Association, NWCSA. In its political ideology, we might describe them as being a Marxist-Leninist group. It has strong links with George Padmore, one member who was providing much of the information on Payne's political roots in Trinidad, Christina King, whose evidence we have before us, informs us that we sent into Barbados. So here is a situation where a migrant from Barbados is sent back to Barbados to stir up things. We wanted him to tell the workers what was going on here in Trinidad and to assist. As Sir Woodville Marshall tells us, Christina King insists that Payne was chosen for the Barbadian mission because of his Barbadian connections. And she informed us, and this is what Professor Marshall informs us, having interviewed Christina King. She points out that the NWCSA made a collection to pay his fare, and they left it for him to find means of reporting about the Barbadians. But the major point for our statement here on Clement Payne really is just to indicate that the migration, yes, the migration that we're talking about, this migration of Barbadians to Trinidad has a dual impact. There's an impact on the Trinidadian landscape. Many of the migrants get involved in social reform movements, like Clement Payne. But some of them also are in communication. Some of them do become members of the Garveyite movement, the United Negro Improvement Association, the branches of the Garveyite movement, and they're in constant contact with their Barbadian friends and relatives. Another phase of migration, apart from the one that goes between the 1870s and into the 1920s and 30s, is the migration that takes place during the 1930s and the 40s. During World War II, there was a significant migration from Barbados to Trinidad. Much of it was in order to meet the demand of the US naval bases for labor. As Kelvin Singh, another researcher, informs us, few migrants from other West Indian countries wished to work in the sugar belt. However, by early 1942, over 2,000 Barbadians had already contracted to work on the naval bases. So if you're looking at Trinidad and looking at the Barbadian migration, apart from that early migration that we spoke about before, you have a later migration in 1930s, 1940s, particularly during the Second World War, when Barbadians are moving there to work on the naval bases. And a lot of Barbadian families still have connections with Trinidad because of that early migration, that period. And again, those Barbadians who go over tend to be Barbadians who are slightly better educated than their Creole, the Trinidadian Creole counterparts. Now, quite apart from saying that, from what we just shared, we're reaching nearly the last lap of our presentation. It's just to note that the impact of Barbadian migration to Trinidad, and I'm going to come back to the question of the Trinidad aspect of our discussion in a minute. There's a big impact of Barbadians on the folklore and the calypso culture of the Trinidadian state. Before I give you the first example of this impact, let's come back again to make the point that taken away at the very beginning. Barbadian planters take laborers to Tobago, establish plantations in Tobago. When the Trinidadian planters needed labor, Barbadian slaves were exported to Trinidad. So there's an earlier movement, some of it forced, otherwise some of it is voluntary. Later, as we move into the post-emancipation period, many Barbadians migrate on their own. They choose to migrate because of the better wage situations. Then you have a situation where after that early movement, we went into the area of the Second World War, and many Barbadian families have many Barbadians who migrated there, settled in Trinidad and Tobago. There's one thing I did not put into my research, and I just remembered it as I was making that point, so let me slip it in here. I have not evaluated the impact of the University of West Indies and the location of the faculty of engineering, those faculties, agriculture in Trinidad. I have not located that with migration, but that also has its impact. Many Barbadians, there used to be a body in Trinidad called ECFI. I think it's called the East Caribbean. There was the Farm Technology Institute. Yeah, the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture. That's what it became later, but yes. So many Barbadians who went there to study, they did not come back to Barbados. Once they established themselves there, they also became embedded in the Trinidadian population. So I have not done any specific research on that, but I'm aware because there's some of my colleagues at the University of the West Indies in the past who can trace their origin not directly to Barbados, but to Trinidad, the parents having come out of a Barbadian background. So here we are. So here now we've gone past that as a summary of what we've been looking at. And now we're coming to the question of the impact on folklore. Now, Barbadians could not have been going to Trinidad and to Tobago without some impact on the folklore. And I know that there's a calypso in particular which established this impact. We know the calypso very well. And I'm not going to sing it. I promise you I will not sing it. There is a calypso we call known as the Smart Bayesian. I think many people know that calypso very well, by the Mighty Sparrow. I just reading some of the words. A Barbadian engineer, I think, I'm not sure if I have it there on the thing, but let's see if I have it. I might have it, yes. A Barbadian engineer by the name of Cephas. Now, Cephas is one of those names that one associates with an early vintage Barbados. Got to know that Trinidadians were superstitious. This Bajan smart man by the name of Cephas got to know that Trinidadians were superstitious. Repeating, that's typical Calypso technique. So he buy a piece of land up Honolulu Mountain, put some concrete around the spring and open a fountain. When in less than no time, when you hear the shout, stupid people coming from all about. And then he goes on, I am sure, next slide, I am sure that you'll be surprised to know how much big shots does go up to Mount Honolulu. All kind of people believe in this thing. If you see so many old maids in search of a ring, throwing coins in the fountain like they're feeding fish, kneeling down on their knees, making a wish. Some of the people were going up there daily, Trinidad was coming just like Italy. And then, of course, you remember that he has in that, I promise not to sing, but you know there's a part that says, so many coins in the fountain. And I love to listen. But what we often miss is that this notion of this Barbadian man, this is a common theme. The Barbadian man who thought he was a little better than the others, a little wiser, a little cleverer. This is captured in the Calypso. But then we have another Calypso as well, which speaks to this notion of the Barbadian as trying to put one over on his Trinidadian counterparts. And of course, that next one, we see the next Calypso comes out from Sparrow's partner in crime, Lord Kitchener. And that one, you know the story again. I haven't had a meeting, he writes, but that's not the title. And it goes on to say, the Bajan say, look, Trini, let me make a cook. I put the rice, you're gonna put the meat. Then we can both have something to eat. But when the pot was nearly done, the Bajan decided to pull a fast one. He said, Trini, I am a born Barbadian. I don't like to fight. But when it comes to the kitchen, man, I stick for me right. You put in a 12 cents meat bone, you worse than lice. I can give you a advice, take your meat out my rice. Again, the notion, this struggle, this captures what Bridget Bertha and the other church have been talking about. That conflict between the working class Trinidadian and the Bajans who became the policemen and also when the skilled professions became teachers and lawyers and others. And this is, but I suggest here that this is a reflection of that impact on the social fabric of Trinidad and Tobago. And now, okay. Now, okay. So now I come to the last use, the use of another term. This is part of the impact on Trinidadian folklore. I don't have a slide for that one, but this is where it is. And the historical evidence that I'm looking at now has to do with the whole question of the term Bajon. Where does the term Bajon come from? As used by Trinidadians. Well, what we've come to understand, I'm told that Professor Gordon Royler was one time had declared that Bajon was really the corruption of Bajan. I do not have that evidence before me, so I can't confirm that is so. But what I do know is that there was a man called John Archer, a Barbadian, who was apparently a habitual criminal of the early 20th century in Trinidad. And by the time of his death, he had amassed some 119 convictions. And his nickname was Bajon, John Archer. And he was so identified as Bajon in several editions of the Port of Spain Gazette, which recorded his numerous appearances before the courts. So what I'm really saying here is that the migration of Barbadians was bound to have had an impact on the social fabric of Trinidad and Tobago. Again, I say and Tobago because clearly the evidence that we have, the written evidence is not as strong for Tobago, but the fact remains that because once Tobago becomes a part of Trinidad politically, then people move from Trinidad and into Tobago. You had the movement, what I call the cross movement of some Barbadians. The police force from Trinidad, which was stationed in Tobago, again, largely made up of people of Barbadian origin. So once we get a chance to have a look at what I call the migration of Barbadians to this area, we begin to pick up certain impacts, we begin to pick up certain vestiges of that migration in certain locations. I was in Trinidad and I happened to pass by a doctor's office and saw the name. And the minute I saw the name, I knew immediately without being asked, this was a Barbadian. The surname was Brathwaite. And once I saw that, I knew right away that this is one element of the visit. There was a professor of the University of Western as well. I think Carrington is his name. And I too was curious as to how it was that he carried the name Carrington, because not many Trinidadians carried the name. But when I checked with him, his ancestry was Barbados. He became Pro-Vice Chancellor and eventually became the Pro-Vice Chancellor, and I think became the principal of the Ghana University at one time. And you all should try to find it. You find this location. Names tell you things. Yes, some names are from Sigrid and other places, but a lot of the names are names that we recognize right here in Barbados. I'm going to close just now, but I just wanted to say a shout out to those of you who might be here in our audience who are from Trinidad, or who might be from Toronto or New York or somewhere, but your origin is in Barbados through Trinidad to these locations. I want to give a shout out to my colleagues and my friends, many of whom I know from our sister island. Incidentally, I hold no malice of forethought or otherwise concerning the flying fish, which have migrated to Tobago and then later to Trinidad. One must understand, there's a place in Tobago called Barbados Bay. I don't know if you know that, but Tobago has had an early connection. I said plantations from Barbados were established in Tobago. And Barbadian slaves left and went to Tobago. It is quite possible, therefore, that if you're thinking of acquiring a wife or somebody you want to draw some close connection, you might have to ask a couple of questions, some very serious questions, because if you're not careful, you might be connecting with somebody who is a very close genetic connection with yourself. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Professor Welch, for taking us through those phases of Barbadian migration to Trinidad during slavery, the immediate post-emancipation period, the period coming up to and after World War II, and also the effects of the education at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. We are now open for your questions and comments. We already have some comments in the chat. This is Carlton Haywood, said he was born in 1940 and grew up until about 1958 in Tunapuna in the ward of Tacarigua.
Yes.
And you have more anchored me in my Haywood and Maxwell ancestors who have traced the Haywood to Duke Haywood on a slave plantation. I was surrounded by Barbadians and Grenadians in my space. Perhaps this has something to do with ourselves, the Hayward.
Yes, 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 yes.
Right. Right. We also have another one, so you can comment after. From a genealogical research perspectives, are there records documenting the migration of Barbadians to Trinidad and Tobago and British Guyana, including the names and dates of the migration? So I will just move that you can answer of my mic that you can answer.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for those questions and those comments. Certainly, I want to welcome my colleague, my kinfolk, those who can trace the ancestry back to Tacarigua and other places of that kind. Certainly, names that you mentioned there, the Maxwell and other names, they say something about your connections. There are many I will say this, the vast majority of Afro-Trinidadians are actually connected to Barbados, genetically and otherwise, the vast majority. Sometimes the difficulty we have with the tracing their ancestry has more to do with people's severing of connections than with what they call, what they may say, the official records that you could look at. If you have people who travel, but then for whatever reason there's a disconnect with, whether it's back home or not. Sometimes you have gaps that you not easy to fill. But again, I think the records, the archival records in Barbados are fairly well organized, as well as they are in Trinidad and Tobago. So I think that if you're searching for those connections, that something that they'll be found. Some will be found here in Barbados, of course. If you have ancestry in Barbados, the local archives will be of some assistance to try to get that for you. There's a question about the records, trying to find the records for migration to Trinidad and British Guyana. Let me say that I'm not as au fait with the particular records in British Guyana, but I know, and if it's true for British Guyana as it was true for Suriname, which is next door, I know that there are records that for Suriname that say that lists the enslaved person, list the laborers who left after emancipation in the 1890s or so, the plantation that they went to. I visited Trinidad, Suriname on 2 occasions, and I went to the archives in Suriname. And because of my visit there, I ended up by writing an article on Barbadian migration to Suriname. And in that article, I was able to point out that the records are fairly well kept, and again, of course, it requires traveling to Suriname. In the case of Ghana, which is then British Guyana, I'm not entirely certain how strong the archival records are, but I am assuming that you should be able to find records related to the Barbadian peasants, Barbadian migration. There are reports in the Barbados archives. There are reports of migrants to British Guyana and other places, because there was the superintendent of supervisor of immigration in Barbados. There's a man called R. Cropper in the late 19th century, who was this person looked after records. So possibly one might find that there are records in the local archives that might help you. Some records might speak more to the question of numbers traveling than necessarily names. But it's possible if you could find those. And case of Trinidad, I myself have not had the opportunity to, but I suspect that some of the records that we want to find are records in Trinidad, in Britain, and the National Archives in Britain, with a lot of government documents that in some cases you will find records there which can help you to trace it. One of the sources that sometimes you can find, if you're fortunate enough, is ships records. When ships sail through the region, very often they landed in various locations, from Barbados to Trinidad, Barbados to British Guiana. And in some cases, the record of the ship's record will state that the passenger by name and state when the passenger, where they landed. So that's a possibility. Yes. I wish you luck. I wish you a lot of hard work, because it's not hard work, but it's possible.
Thank you, Professor. I just wanted to add, Frederick Allen would have done his thesis looking at Barbadian migration to British Guiana and Brazil.
Yes.
So he would have been a good person to speak of some of the sources he would have used to document that movement.
That's correct.
Yes. Okay. We have Angela Gabriel, who thanks you, Professor. She says that the presentation is very informative and it explains her DNA connections to so many Trinidadians. We have Dale Kenfensa. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. My grandmother, Catherine Hines, was born in 1905, I believe, and had 3 children. 2 of these children moved to Trinidad in the 1940s, raised their children and did not return. My dad, Clement Hines, later Neto Nash or Neto Kifense, was my grandmother's, just give me a minute, was my grandmother's last child, and because Canada had opened up by that time, he came of age. He moved there in the 1960s. Thank you for shedding light on the immigration pattern and how it impacted my family. I look forward to watching it again and learning things as I'll catch through a second viewing. So that's a thank you. We have another person, Linda. Very well done and informative. Certainly within my own family, there are many Trinidadian connections. Dorian Stricker, this is from Facebook. I would like to know more about Bajans who went to Trinidad in the 1940s. My dad was one of them, but I know nothing about his life there before I was born. Yes. Okay, let me just come out that you can.
Okay, hold on then. Yes. Yes. Okay, I think I guess. The question of the migration to Trinidad in the 1940s, this is during the Second World War. And it is possible again that you could find some records that deal with that some of imperial records. By imperial records, I mean records in Britain, military records, because a lot of people were recruited. Some people were recruited by the Americans to work on the naval base, etc. And it is quite possible that that the official records, which speak to the people who migrate, who move from the governor's reports. The governors will be, the various governors of the Caribbean territories will issue reports to the colonial office. And in some of those reports, you'll see compilations which lists people, you list the people who were traveling. So that's possible. You could find, perhaps you could find that. You could find some official imperial records, which could help in identifying persons who traveled in the 1940s. Maybe even the Library of Congress records which led to the American recruitment of workers from these particular locations. when it comes to the question of the same person just asked about the father or the ancestor who came from Barbados, when Trinidad, I suspect that the way how to trace that person will be here in Barbados again. Check the Barbados archives. Try to get a genealogical survey, which will establish where they're from, who their parents were, etc. And that might help to establish some connections. That is there. I also noticed a couple of things here on the chat. Just let me say I'm here. There was someone made a point that with respect to the point he made about Suriname. Suriname was seen as a foreign country. Well, it was a foreign country. That is correct, and therefore you might have more of those official records because people travel. But the records are in Suriname, not in the Caribbean. The records for the migrants to Suriname are in Suriname, and they're for that reason. I see somebody here also. My maternal grandfather, Henry Gamble, came to Trinidad as a policeman, right? So Gamble again is one of those names that one can. I think I've lost something here just now. Let me see if it. Something seems to have lost. I think I've lost. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, yes, I saw that one with Henry Gamble.
Yes.
Yes. Let us go. There are quite a few messages. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them.
No.
Right.
But I've lost something that's gone here altogether. I don't the page. Let's see here.
Okay, well, I will tell you. You can mute your mic and I will just.
No, I'm not seeing that page at all. I'm trying to see what happened here. No, I'm not seeing. No, everything is not.
All right. Just mute your mic and I will tell you the comments.
The page, the mute button, everything.
Oh, okay. All right, folks, just give us a minute.
Oh, thank you.
All right, thanks for your indulgence, technology. Okay, here's another one from, okay,
There's one check the youth population. When waterside is that going to decide not yet come up? Very quickly, just to get this one in here. Yes, I'm just responding to a query here, I think from Romo Spencer. It says, "My understand that Barbados had a very huge population. Well, not huge, but compared to other Caribbean territories, population density in Barbados was perhaps the highest population density in this part of the world. Way more in Trinidad. And so I didn't bring it up because I thought it was pretty well known that Barbados had, and still has, in fact, one of the highest population densities in the world. That's density, but not in terms of the actual quantum of the population. And the point here is also the suggestion that the migration of business to Trinidad was also primarily to encourage the French-speaking Trinis to speak English. So all the police and public servants were strictly, well, yeah. But I suppose that one can argue that the colonial authorities from Britain did have an objective in mind by bringing Barbadian policemen in, and that was to as it were to use divide and rule tactics to control the local population. It is possible that the bringing of Barbadians to Trinidad was intended to impose an Englishness, as it were, on Trinidad, but I'm not so sure that there were enough Barbadians who were brought over to influence French-speaking Trinidadians to speak English. I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I go ahead?
Like we have.
Not fair.
We actually have Roma who wants to speak. Roma, you have the mic.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so very much, Dr. Welch, for such an informative webinar lecture today. I too, as I said, I'm descended from Barbados. My grandfather, the late Henry Gamble, was from Barbados. My maternal family is the only family with that name, Gamble, in Trinidad, simply because, as you well know, it was just he alone came, you know, as a policeman to work in Trinidad, and eventually he moved over to being a fireman. And one of his claim to fame is he was one of the firemen that operated the first fire engine in Trinidad that fought the great Red House fire or something like that. Anyhow, the question is the name Gamble, is that a common name in Barbados? I mean, because all we knew is that he came from St. James, and we have this family that we are family to the husbands, and that's all we know. And I'm trying, you know, in my very best to trace the family history.
Okay, Roma, just give us a minute to
Sure.
Professor to respond.
No, I'm not hearing her. I look at here, everything's your ear. Let me see. No, it is open.
Oh, it is so. Okay, that's why.
Yes, if she asks, I just repeat.
Yes.
Are you hearing me now, Dr. Welch?
No, can you repeat? Can you repeat, please? I can hear you now.
Sure, great. I was saying that my grandfather on my maternal side is Henry Gamble. He came from Barbados as a police to Trinidad, and eventually moved from being a police to one of the very first firemen in Trinidad. One of his great claim to fame is that, not claim to fame, it's his picture and everything is all up in the fire headquarters in Trinidad, where he was one of the first firemen to operate one of the firemen that operated the very first fire engine in Trinidad that fought the Great Red House fire. Now, the question I want to ask is, now, in my family, that name Gamble is the only name in Trinidad. The only Gambles that are in Trinidad is my family, basically descendants of his children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on. There are no other Gambles in Trinidad, simply because he was the only one that came to Trinidad from Barbados. There were no other brothers or sisters. I want to know, you know, if the name Gamble is a popular name in Barbados, because all we know is that he came from St. James, and we have family that are the husbands. The husbands are also family. So I'm trying to do my own little trace, my ancestral trace of my grandfather's family and that name Gamble. So I don't know if you have any knowledge around, you know, that name as a familial name in Barbados. Just as we know, when you call some names in Trinidad, you say Sealy, you say Braffett, you know, you have names that you can say in Trinidad that, you know, is descended from Barbados. And on my paternal side, there's also my great grandmother's husband was Archer, who came from Barbados as well. Again, the name Archer, you know, is Barbados. But that name Gamble is very, very, very odd. So I'm wondering if that name still exists in Barbados.
Yes, the straight answer to your question is that certainly the name Gamble does exist. It's not one of the more common Barbadian names, but there are Gambles still living here in Barbados. And if you want to trace them, you know, you have your father's name, you know what his name was. See, in some cases, some people migrate and things change. And by that I mean that for whatever reason, people and the records are you know, misquoted, misstated, and sometimes names get lost. But you know the name of your ancestor. And what I would suggest is that if you can get to Barbados or get in contact with someone, with genealogists in Barbados, you could in fact try to establish that linkage with your ancestry here. The thing about it is this, that the archives once he traveled to Trinidad, especially if he went in the 1930s, 1940s, he would almost certainly be listed in the records, the birth and baptism records of Barbados. And once you get that, you get the if he had who his mother, father were, and then you can do a further trace to see who the mother, father were related to, and that can help. It is only when you go further back into the 19th century, just after emancipation, that you have a difficulty with identifying, your genealogy. But I think you have a very good chance of being able to connect with relatives here, or find out who the gamblers were that your father was connected with. Yes.
Thank you very much. What I do know is that he would have come there at the turn of the early 1900s.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, he would have married my grandmother, and my own mother was born in 1923.
Okay.
And then there are other bigger brothers and sisters before her. Yeah. So it means that he came there somewhere in the early 1900s. Yeah.
Yes. Well, let me suggest something to you as well. There's a website called familysearch.org. And the website familysearch.org, especially if it's a period just before the 1900s, if you can get in there and put in gamble and look, search, it might have to start there. Familysearch.org. It is a site operated by the Mormon Church, but they came to Barbados and throughout the Caribbean and recorded a lot of the names that were found in the baptismal and birth records and the marriage records and the death records. So try that. Try the familysearch.org, all lowercase, no capital letters, and try to get that. You can go online and look at that, put the name in and see what you find. Maybe you might have to come to Barbados, but try that first. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I've been.
Thank you. Sorry, Roma, we have to move on from you right now. We have quite a few questions backed up. Perhaps you can contact me directly, but there are some responses in the chat related to your question. Donna Hunt Cox is saying that the gambles are associated with St. Joseph. Yes, and there's also Angela Gabriel, who says she has 3 DNA matches to gambles from the USA. So perhaps you can send me, well, I'll ask Elena to type my email address in the chat, library@barbnews.org.bb, and right, and you can contact me and we'll see if we can put you all in contact. Yeah, so right. Don't think that we are going to be able to answer all of these questions. I think the last one we have here, Marcia Nurse. What role did racial classification play in the recruitment of police in 1803 to early years? I don't think it's 1803. No. Well, perhaps what role did racial classification play? It has been my understanding that the men who went to Trinidad were formerly the poor white men who are normally jumpers on plantation militia. Okay, answer that and then we will allow Sharon to speak. So just let me, hold on a minute, Sharon.
Just before we hear Sharon, just let me respond to Marcia Nurse's query. The fact is this, that in Barbados, there were some people called jumpers, but there are not too many of them. Too many jumpers. The jumpers were normally located in Bridgetown, and they were used to keep order. And they're punished and state persons. I've written about that in my book, Slave Society in the City. The police force really is more a post-emancipation development, like the 1830s, 1840s. And when it comes to the question of racial identification in the recruitment of policemen, that is part of it. The police who were recruited from Barbados to go to Trinidad were often used in policing the East Indian immigrants. And in fact, there is a discussion or an argument which suggests that some of the East Indian Afro conflict in Trinidad is exacerbated by the antagonism which the East Indians held against the policemen, mostly Barbadian, particularly when the East Indians were celebrating their Jose Moraine festivals and other carnival festivals that they had. And these were put down, these were suppressed by the police. That led to more antagonism. And therefore, the authorities well knew that these Afro-Barbadian policemen will be what we call a tool in their hands to control the East Indians. So in that context, there is this racial issue. But in terms of poor whites going as policemen to Trinidad, that is not a major historical event in the connection between Barbados and Trinidad. Sharon, yes, let me see if I can.
Thank you so much for rewarding my patience. I just wanted to share a comment from a friend, Trinidadian, who has lived in Barbados for several years. I shared the flyer for this session with her, and she responded to me. Interestingly, years ago, I helped a friend of mine interviewing landholders for his study in rural Trinidad on comparing Afro and Indian land ownership patterns. And we discovered that the Afro-Trinidadians who passed their land from generation to generation, like Indian Trinidadians, were primarily of Barbadian descent. They also had generations of families who went into the same profession: teachers, policemen, nurses. And of course, when I came to live here, the names made more sense: Carringtons, Brathwaites, Fords, Granhams, etc. So that's my little footnote.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, yes.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Sharon. I just won, we finished Semper Bailey. We said Semper Bailey was my great-grandfather who came from Barbados. He wants to know if that name could possibly be associated with Bailey's plantation.
Let me go here. See, I just have to get back again. Oh, yes. Bailey. With respect to the query about the name Bailey, it is possible that the name Bailey could be associated with Bailey's plantation. However, there's just one thing that we need to be aware of, and that is this: is that a lot of English surnames in Barbados are not necessarily associated with the plantation. There's a myth in Barbados very often that the bulk of surnames were acquired from the plantation owners. They gave them, as it were, to blacks. The fact is that at emancipation, and I've done a significant study on the emancipation baptism records, thousands of persons had single names coming out of slavery and slavery. There were no surnames for the most part. If you got the names from the plantation owners, one would expect that in a particular location around a plantation, one would find clusters of it even today. But the fact is that a lot of enslaved people had no surnames, came to emancipation, and it took about another generation for all the Barbadian population to really acquire all the surnames. So, so it is possible that the name Bailey might well have been a name chosen or adopted by your ancestors. It could be connected to the plantation. That is possible. It is certainly an English name, but not all English names were given by plantation owners. That's the point that I'm trying to make. So that you might find there are other places in Barbados where Bailey's, the name Bailey is common, but is not necessarily connected with or even close to the plantation. Well, that was that.
Thank you so much, Professor Welch. Sharon, do you want to make a final point? I see your hand is still up.
My error, I forgot to lower the hand.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. And I
No.
just want to commend Professor Welch again for another very engaging presentation.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you who are attending today. We're sorry that we cannot answer all of the questions, but please send your comments or questions to library@barbnews.org.bb. I'm sure that Professor Welch will not mind answering some of those questions if I forward them to him. So please do that, library@barbnews.org.bb. So I just want to thank Professor Welch for a very engaging, informative presentation today. He never disappoints. Right. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I also want to thank all of you out there who have joined us on Zoom or on Facebook. Thank you for taking the time. And remember that the presentation will be uploaded to our YouTube channel for your second or third and viewing at your convenience. And remember, there are all of our presentations we've had in Zoom, and most of them that we started recording on Facebook Live are now on our YouTube channel. So you can go back and have a second listen. So thank you all again. Our next meeting is scheduled for May 18th. We have Dr. Dan Carter, who will speak on understanding and using the Barbados vestry records for genealogical research. Thanks again, Professor. Thanks to our audience. Thank you, Elena, our technical guru. And I wish you all the best. So stay safe until we meet again online on May 18th. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Okay.